Coming in at number 10 is Batman vs. Prometheus. This may be one of the silliest yet coldest Batman takedowns I have ever seen. In fact, down in the comments, I want you guys to let me know your favorite absolutely wacky Batman takedowns. But for now, let me explain this one. The first time Prometheus encounters the Justice League, and specifically Batman, he overcomes them all, just showing how much of a force to be reckoned with that he is. As for how he brought down Batman in hand-to-hand combat, the villain does what all villains do and gloats about how he did it. Using his helmet, he is able to program the skills of the 30 greatest martial arts masters in the world, including Batman himself, into his body and brain for his own use. Not one to be outdone like that though. When the time comes for the rematch, Batman cheats and forces Prometheus into using an older version of his helmet, but this version had been tampered with by Batman so that instead of the 30 greatest martial artists, Prometheus now has access to the physical abilities and skills of none other than Professor Stephen Hawking. Now, Batman could very easily punch the lights out of Prometheus, who is stuck with muscular neuron disease that renders him a drooling catatonic. God, it's almost offensive, but it's just so good and such a Batman thing to do, like outthinking his opponent like that. Number 9. Magneto vs. the Red Skull. Magneto and the Red Skull are on opposite sides of history. Magneto grew up in a Jewish family living in Germany during World War II, and we all know Red Skull and Hydra's stance in World War II Germany, so it's safe to say that these two villains will almost never get along. Right? In Acts of Vengeance from 1989, Magneto and Red Skull were actually temporarily united. But it's really important to note that Magneto was unsure whether this was the Red Skull that aided Germany in the slaughter of his people. So Magneto confronted him, and the Red Skull confirmed that he was indeed the original, which was a mistake. It didn't take much for Magneto, the master of magnetism, to overpower the Skull, but unlike what you might think, Magneto does not take his life. Instead, Magneto leaves the Skull isolated in a stripped-down fallout shelter 20 feet underground. He removed the ladder from the escape hatch, gave him 10 gallons of water, took out his homing transmitters, gave him no food and no light, just water, air, and his own depraved thoughts. Number 8. Peter Parker vs. Kingpin. If there's one thing you just don't do, it's messing with Aunt May. After Peter had revealed his identity to the world, his past villains were all coming back to get some more personal revenge. This put his family in danger, and despite his best attempts to protect them, when an assassin tried to bring him down, he dodged out of the way and Aunt May happened to be in the line of fire. This transitioned immediately to the Back in Black SpiderMan arc, which saw Peter don his black spider suit and go on a warpath to find out who was responsible for hiring the assassin. Eventually, Peter learns that it was none other than Kingpin who hired the goon. Fisk was in prison at this time, but using an extremely large stash of cash that he somehow had hidden within his prison furniture. I don't know, it's a comic book, just roll with it. Fisk was able to get out of his cell, release the other inmates, and get about halfway through the prison before Spider-Man came crashing in. And after letting Kingpin monologue a little bit, he proceeds to lay an incredible beatdown on the Kingpin of crime in front of an entire prison wing of his underlings. But then, to make it much more personal, Spider-Man takes off the black suit to show that it's Peter Parker beating the snot out of Kingpin. Then he slaps the hell out of Fisk, threatens to spin webbing down his throat, and then explains how pathetic he is in front of all of his underlings, striking right at the Kingpin's massive pride. Number 7. Jericho vs. Vigilante. Joey Wilson, aka Jericho, is technically usually a superhero, despite being the son of Deathstroke, one of the world's best assassins. The same serum that gave Deathstroke his powers and enhancements also gave Jericho his powers, but they differ largely from Deathstroke's. Jericho has a very unique and powerful ability that allows him to transfer his consciousness into the body of another and take control of them by making eye contact with that person. Unfortunately, every time he did this, a small shred of the individual's psyche remained in his head. At first, it was nothing that he couldn't deal with, but over time, possessing multiple people, he had so many psyches running around his head it drove him insane and put him on a warpath that needed to see him brought down. The rogue anti-hero known as Vigilante was the one to take on the responsibility of stopping Jericho, but because of Jericho's sister insisting that Jericho was a good person at heart and should not lose his life, Vigilante decided to not deal with this threat in a completely lethal way. No, instead, Vigilante just completely took Jericho's eyes from his head. Blind and unable to use his powers, the threat of his abilities was gone. But I'm pretty sure it did nothing to stop his mental instability. In fact, it likely made it worse. Number 6. Wally West versus Inertia. Inertia was a young villainous Thaddeus Thawne. Inertia is to Bart Allen, aka Impulse, what Eobard Thawne is to Barry Allen. He is his reverse. Now, Inertia had been raised his whole life to absolutely despise speedsters of any kind. He learned to be a villain from others, but his actions were all of his own. So, when Inertia made the mistake of taking the life of his opposite, Bart Allen, he would be made to suffer the consequences. Unfortunately for him, those consequences came in the form of Wally West, one of the most powerful speedsters ever. After taunting Wally about the fact he just took the life of his sidekick, in All Flash #1, Wally takes the young villain, who had the potential to be reformed, mind you, and removes his ability to move at all, traps Inertia in a museum as one of the exhibits, only able to blink once every 100 years, and leaves the kid there still thinking in real time during all of this, meaning he's driven slowly and pretty surely insane. And just as the cherry on top, Wally left him facing the exhibit of Bart Allen, the man that Inertia could have been. It's an incredibly dark fate for a hero to impose on a villain, especially one that small. Number 5. Superman versus the Joker. The Injustice video game and comic books took the simple premise of an evil Superman and turned it into an awesome story with really cool moments. The designs created for the heroes are mostly really cool, and only slight variations of their best looks. The reasons that heroes and villains choose sides against one another is also really cool, and it gives some of the most ridiculous shows of force for Superman himself. But it all kicks off with one simple event. The Joker decides that he has become bored of Gotham, so he turns his gaze on Metropolis. The dark and twisted games that this character plays work really well with Batman, who is in reality just a normal human named Bruce Wayne. But when the Joker has to face someone with actual power, he's exponentially way more likely to come out on the bottom. So, when he decided to crack Superman by tricking the hero into ending the life of Lois Lane and then blowing up a large part of Metropolis, he does succeed for just a few hours, until Superman shows up at the room where the clown is being interrogated by Batman, and Superman just bursts in, ignoring Batman completely, and in one cold move, he plunges his fist straight through the Joker's chest, stopping his heart immediately. And number 4, Midnight vs. Commander. The Authority is a really cool group from DC Comics' Wildstorm universe. The two most well-known heroes from the team would be Apollo and Midnighter, who are basically like Superman and Batman respectively, only these two are husband and husband, and Midnighter is almost insane. He is like Batman, but like Batman who is also mixed with the Punisher and maybe like a bit of Deadpool. And these stories get dark. In Mark Millar's run on the Authority, a villain by the name of Commander makes the very big mistake of attacking and forcing himself on Apollo. This was a hell of a mistake, because in response to those actions, Apollo, after recovering, burns Commander's legs so that he can't escape, and Midnighter shows up with a jackhammer. And the rest is something we are kept from seeing. If you want to check it out for yourself, you may be my guest, but you've been warned, it is quite haunting. Number 3, Captain Cold versus Johnny Quick. If you have not read Forever Evil, I highly recommend you do. It's such a dark and crazy story that sees the villains of the DC universe step into the heroic side to take down an evil Justice League from the alternate reality of Earth 3. Each member of this crime syndicate of America is a sick and twisted perversion of their Prime Earth counterpart. But of all of them, Johnny Quick, the stand-in for the Flash, may be the most messed up. He's a completely deranged serial killer in his world, and one villain just can't stand for someone dragging the Flash's name in the dirt like that: Leonard Snart, Captain Cold. In their confrontation, Mr. Quick gets a hold of Cold's weapon, the Cold Gun, and then gloats about how he had taken the life of the alternate Snart on Earth 3, and how Captain Cold is defenseless without his finger on the trigger of his weapon. Well, it turns out that Snart singing Jingle Bells Batman Smells activates the Cold Gun voice trigger, which then completely freezes Quick's leg, which is when Captain Cold takes his big old right boot heel and completely shatters this maniac's leg. Have fun accessing the Speed Force now, psycho! Haha! And at number 2, Black Panther and the Skrulls. Wakanda, like the other fictional kingdoms of Atlantis and Latveria, is protected by a man who will do anything to protect his people. T'Challa doesn't really have the luxury of sparing those that would do harm to his incredibly advanced home, but Wakanda is also one of the #1 places targeted when an invading force wants to take over Earth. So, taking those two facts into account, when the Skrulls tried to invade Wakanda to start their mission of dominating the world, T'Challa and his wife Storm of the X-Men left those aliens with a clear message. After tricking the Skrulls into inflicting pain on their own men for information, the Skrulls sent out their best warriors for the task of taking down the pair. But just as those toughest warriors are gone from sight, an army of Wakandan soldiers breaks into the Skrull ship and leaves not a single Skrull soul alive. While that's happening, those quote toughest warriors are turned into pulp by Black Panther, with T'Challa using their blood to write quote, "This is what happens when you invade Wakanda," on the bridge of the Skrull ship, cold. Number 1, Constantine versus Dr. Fate. It's funny, I never really thought I'd see Dr. Fate as a villain, and in a way this isn't exactly that. It's more like the Helmet of Fate and Naboo himself is the villain. In Constantine Future's End, John has stolen the Helmet of Fate, who without a wearer is just a measly old artifact with one of the world's most powerful sorcerers trapped inside. Allowing himself to get ensnared by the helmet, linking John and Naboo's minds, John trapped Naboo in the auditorium of Anubis. He fairly challenges Naboo to prove that he has actually ever cared about anyone other than himself in front of the ancient Egyptian god. If Naboo wins, then Constantine dies and Naboo is free to do what he does. Despite his great deeds though, he can't actually prove that he cares about anyone. When Constantine summoned the helmet, it immediately started influencing people to come and claim the helmet and save Naboo. But Constantine had set up a man to subdue each person that was called by the helmet, and when one person didn't make it, another would be called, and then another, and so on. Each person just being used as a tool by Naboo, who didn't care what happened to any of them. He proves that Naboo doesn't give a damn, and then Naboo is eaten by Anubis, just straight up eaten. Now it turns out, even the challenge was a trick, with Constantine making a deal with the demon Ifrit, who now inhabits the Helmet of Fate in the place of and sort of alongside Naboo, bargaining with those who choose to wear the helmet from this point forward. Coming in at number 10 is Daredevil versus Bullseye. Imagine being the guy who continuously gets his butt handed to him by Daredevil, to the point that you've been saved and brought back too, multiple times, with enhancements, and he still leaves you stuck in an iron lung with the ability to do nothing but stare and talk very quietly. Imagine being that guy, and in another act of attempted vengeance, you mastermind a whole evil plan to get your revenge with your limited communication abilities, and then in Daredevil Volume 3, number 27, this red-suited man without fear unravels your plans and then makes sure the jar that's keeping you alive gets filled with a toxic chemical, leaving you completely blind. Well, that's what happened to Bullseye. As Foggy Nelson said, once the deadliest man in the world, and now all he will be is a living brain inside a flesh and bone coffin. That's terrifying. Number 9, the Hulk versus Abomination. Abomination in the MCU was once an incredibly intimidating villain, and he still sort of is, but also kind of like a hippie, and kind of funny. In the comics though, Emil Blonsky is absolutely ruthless. General rule for the MCU movies for you right here. If you like a character, just imagine them doing everything they do, but turn it up to 10 and then you'll have their comic book counterpart. Mostly. What my point is here is that the Abomination is psychotic, and the Hulk is way more brutal. So, when the Abomination took the life of Betty Ross using his irradiated blood, he was not getting out of it easy. When they come head to head in the Incredible Hulk Volume 25 from 2000, it's arguably one of the best Incredible Hulk fights I've ever seen. Emil comes walking out of the water, and before he even knows what happens, Hulk is on him like shrimps on the barbie. The ground around them almost instantly becomes rubble. The fight travels underwater and through a dam, flooding a whole town. All the while, these two green Goliaths are in a close combat slog match. And then, Emil decides to taunt the Hulk, which is just dumb because it just makes him angrier, increasing his strength, and the Hulk absolutely pummels the Abomination, laying on fist after fist after fist, causing minor earthquakes and leaving Emil on the edge of life with his brain exposed. It's insane. This comic really shows the relationship between these two on a level that's not really captured anywhere else, and you should read it just for their relationship, honestly. Number 8, Batman versus thugs. Have you ever played the Batman Arkham games? The combat in those games is absolutely fantastic, but it still leaves me wondering how many of these random street thugs actually survive after their interaction with Batman, because I doubt it. He hits hard, and he is pretty unforgiving about it, which serves his whole point of instilling fear, sure, but I think because these nameless thugs are cannon fodder, they essentially get the worst beatings of most of Batman's villains, and we never hear from most of them again. So that tells you all you need to know. As an example, let's talk about a group of thugs in the All-Star Batman and Robin series, issue number 7. Now this comic is written by Frank Miller, who seems to be able to get away with making Batman do pretty much anything, I guess. Like, there's no rules with Frank Miller. Like in the opening pages of the issue, Batman comes speeding into a group of armed thugs, foot first, maniacally laughing like the Joker, and talking in his head about how Gotham is full of cockroaches. He relishes in the fact that the criminals are so scared that they are disposing of each other accidentally, and then he sets fire to a bottle of bleach and tosses it into the criminals, blanketing them in fire, and then continuously beating the snot out of them while they're on fire. And then what happens next? You'll never guess, because Black Canary pops up out of nowhere, and these two superheroes just start making out and getting busy while the thugs are literally barbecuing in the background. Unfortunately, yes, this is Batman, but not my Batman. Number 7, Superman and the Manchester Black Beatdown. What's so funny about truth, justice, and the American way? I don't know. But what I do know is that the Superman story that uses that question as its title, also known as Action Comics issue number 775 for any of you who want to know, is awesome. Essentially, this comic sees the arrival of a group of heroes called the Elite that fight crime, but in an incredibly bombastic and brutal way, with no regard for lives lost. This flies directly in the face of the moralities of heroes like Superman and Batman, but apparently not. The leader of this band of villainous heroes goes by the name Manchester Black, and he has an incredible level of telekinesis, able to punch a hole in a mountain with a simple thought. He is incredibly capable, and so are his team, fixing problems before Superman can even get to the scene. Now eventually, Superman, attempting to stop them from operating using such brutal forms of justice, gets his butt handed back to him during one of their first altercations. But that was Superman with the gloves on. As fast as a speeding bullet, Superman takes down the other 3 members of the Elite, leaving only Manchester Black left. Now in a move colder than I've ever seen before, Superman subtly uses his heat vision through Manchester's eye and cuts the connection between Chester and his telekinetic powers. Essentially, he lobotomized Chester using his heat vision, taking the ability to use his powers at least until the JLA could arrive, and he left the Elite in an unconscious dogpile. Number 6, Magneto beating Apocalypse. Magneto and Apocalypse are 2 incredibly powerful mutant villains with frighteningly similar goals, and yet we never really fully see them teaming up. But we also rarely ever see them fight either, except in the Age of Apocalypse reality. In this world, the Mutant Legion had gone back in time in an attempt to bring an end to Magneto, but he inadvertently caused the passing of Xavier, his father, which led to a world where Magneto forms and leads the X-Men, and Apocalypse has nearly taken over the whole world. This all came to a head in X-Men Omega. Now, on paper, while Magneto is powerful with a capital P, when compared to Apocalypse, he should be a walk in the park for the second mutant to ever exist, and their fight going on simultaneously with about 3 or 4 other little skirmishes is intense. It's full of great lines, crazy twists and turns, but the best part is right near the end. Apocalypse has Magneto on the ropes, and he gloats in his own glory, wondering why the Master of Magnetism isn't fighting back. Now staring straight into Apocalypse's eyes, Magneto says, "I can't, I'm concentrating." And then they both look down to see Magneto's hands at his abdomen as he completely rips Apocalypse in 2 straight down the middle in the most awesome looking panel I have ever seen. It's so good. Number 5. Invincible. Invincible, Mark Grayson, is an incredibly strong character. Being a Viltrumite, Invincible is a member of one of the most unbeatable species in the galaxy. Mark is also a young adult, who hasn't learned how to control himself or his powers completely, so it's interesting that one of his greatest enemies is an incredibly squishy man by the name of Angstrom Levy. That's because Angstrom is pretty intelligent and ruthless, but also because he has the ability to open portals to alternate realities. Using his knowledge of other dimensions, he was able to figure out the alter ego of Invincible and find out where Mark lives. He travels to Mark's home and then captures Mark's mom and brother. First of all, making things this personal never works out for a villain, so they need to stop doing that. But Angstrom does actually put Mark through a good old fight, using portals to send the hero to multiple different dimensions, which was really cool, honestly. Where Levy made a big mistake though was when Mark's mom, Debbie, decides to try and attack the villain using a lamp, smashing it over Levy's big old head. Levy didn't take too kindly to this little affront, and he broke Debbie's arm. Now, in a fit of absolute blinding rage after seeing this, Mark charges full force at Levy and they end up crashing through multiple realities until they land in a sandy desert wasteland. Which is when this idiotic guy Levy decides to threaten Mark's family again. Invincible, still in this blind rage, uses all the strength he has, completely pummeling Levy until Mark looks like he's covered in ketchup and Angstrom is now a huge puddle. But somehow, he still comes back. Number 4, Conquest. Yes, we're still talking about Invincible. For the Viltrumites of this Invincible comic series, they have extremely high resistance to damage, but what makes them even more capable is that when they do get beat down, usually by another Viltrumite, and they survive the damage, once they heal up, they become even stronger than they were before. It's why the oldest Viltrumites are usually the most powerful of the bunch. Now, one old-timer Viltrumite goes by the name of Conquest, and he is one grizzled old man. Battle-scarred as hell with a cybernetic arm and psychotic as hell as well, he arrives on Earth to check on Mark's progress with taking over the planet. That's a whole long story, we don't need to get into it. Essentially, he arrives after Mark had just gone through some I can't say that. So Mark is not in the best mood, but Conquest does not care, and these two have an absolute slog of a battle over the course of 4 issues of the comic. It's insane. Conquest takes a few hits, sure, but Mark is no match for this guy in the slightest. In an attempt to help Invincible, his girl, Adam Eve, decides to show up on the battlefield and lend a hand, and she was far out of her league, but she's very powerful, didn't really matter. Conquest punched a hole right through her. This was the line that you just don't cross. It sends Mark into a frenzy. The two Superman-like beings fly straight at one another, and Mark punches straight through Conquest's cybernetic arm, breaking his own arm in the process. He uses his unbroken hand to clock the old man in the face, he bites a massive chunk out of the guy's shoulder, Adam Eve revives herself out of nowhere, lends a helpful blast, and then when Conquest breaks Mark's other hand, this guy uses his head and headbutts Conquest over and over and over again. It was like 15 hits until what was once his head is now a stomped on can of crushed tomatoes. I don't know if we can even show this one, but it's just insane. Number 3, Squirrel Girl versus Dr. Doom. Look, we're talking comic books here, okay? Just keep that in mind. In Marvel's Superheroes number 8 from 1992, in one corner we've got the full, untested, unbridled powerhouse of Squirrel Girl. And then, in the other corner, we have the Fantastic Four's top enemy, the ruler of Latveria, the man who has wielded the power of the Beyonder, constantly blends incredible technology with powerful magic and artifacts, fueled by his massive, deserved ego. It's the one and only Dr. Victor Von Doom. Who's the winner? Obviously, it's Squirrel Girl, what the hell? Summoning a monstrous horde of squirrels that completely swarm Doom as he cries out, "My much vaunted technology, decimated by these gnawing rodents." And he escapes through a trap door, diving into a river and leaving behind his mask, which Squirrel Girl takes as a trophy. Of all the defeats on this list, this one is definitely brutal. Completely tore that man's pride straight from him and sent him running and screaming with a whole cacophony of squirrels. Damn. That was kind of fun. Number 2, Mr. Dumpo. I know, I'm surprised the Punisher has not shown up on this list too, until now. Honestly, I can tell you why. The Punisher doesn't really have that many memorable villains because his whole thing is that he doesn't let them live. Usually his villains are gone from existence by the end of the issue, and definitely before the end of the series. And usually, he does it very quickly and very easily, but definitely not always. In the Punisher Volume 5, number 11, the Punisher is facing off against a guy called the Russian, who was hired by another bigger bad who we talk about just in a moment. When the two finally come face to face, the fight sees them tumble through Frank's apartment building, crashing into the apartment of Frank's neighbor, Mr. Dumpo. Mr. Dumpo is not the smallest man. In fact, I'd say he's quite large. Yeah, that's how I'd put it. Using a fresh out of the oven scalding hot slice of pizza belonging to Mr. Dumpo, Frank burns the Russian's face, and then Frank takes Mr. Dumpo and tosses him on top of the Russian and dogpiles on top, suffocating the Russian to his demise. Could you imagine going out like that? Just take a moment and think about it. That would be horrible. Number 1. Ma Gnocchi. That's how I'm gonna say it. I said we were about to talk about another Punisher villain, and I wasn't lying. Ma Gnocchi, or however you tell me how you pronounce that in the comments below. Just I can't figure it out. She's the head of the Gnocchi crime family, so yeah, she ain't really a nice lady. Now, before the moment I'm about to talk about, Frank had thought that he had already neutralized the threat of old Ma here, and that's because he literally fed her to a gaggle of polar bears. Now, while they didn't finish her off, the bears did happen to relieve Ma of her arms and legs. It was that action that prompted the hiring of the Russian at the last point. Now, in the Punisher Volume 5, number 12, after taking down about 80, yes, 80 of her thugs, Punisher comes back to finish the job. 80 men were already obliterated, so no one was willing to lend the legless and armless head of crime a hand as Frank burned down her mansion. She put up a decent fight with no limbs though, sort of. After she attempted to gnaw his ankles off, unsurprisingly unsuccessfully, Frank uses his big old foot, plus the muscles in his leg, and not so gently places this helpless, horrible woman into the burning pyre that used to be her home. Cold. Or hot, actually, cause fire. Number 10, Blockbuster. Just like the video rental store that lives far off in a warm place in some of our memories, the villain of the same name, Blockbuster, met a very swift and some could say unjust end. Blockbuster may be a relatively unknown villain to some, and that may be due to the fact that he was primarily a Nightwing villain operating in Bloodhaven. In a tragic series of events, Blockbuster's mother passed away, and Blockbuster blamed this on Nightwing. He set out on a campaign to ruin the hero's life, attempting to take away anything and anyone that mattered to Dick Grayson instead of trying to hurt Nightwing himself. When Nightwing was at his absolute lowest in Nightwing 1996 number 93 from 2004, after a slog of a fight that moved out onto a fire escape, Nightwing had Blockbuster on the ropes when the new vigilante, Tarantula, showed up ready to bring Blockbuster to an end. Now, in a move I just did not see coming, Nightwing leaves his morals at the door, realizing Blockbuster will never stop, and he steps aside to allow Tarantula to end the villain's life. He then went and freaked the hell out while Tarantula started to seduce him. It was really weird, but it happened. Number 9, Spider-Man vs. Firelord. I think it is a well-known fact that Spider-Man pulls his punches. It's part of the reason he is one of the best heroes, but I always forget how much he actually pulls those punches. For example, in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 270, a black-suited Spider-Man puts one hell of a beating on a former Herald of Galactus, Firelord. Previously, Firelord had been wandering the cosmos when he stopped in New York to enjoy the culture, I guess, only to be attacked by firemen and then kicked in the face by Spider-Man. Now, the Lord of Fire wants his revenge. After leading Firelord on a merry chase through office buildings, Grand Central Station, the subway system, into a construction zone, having a building demolished on top of the fiery villain, and then leading him to a gas station which explodes, Spider-Man, at his wit's end, musters all his effort and his spider sense to lay an incredible beatdown of speed, agility, and raw strength on Firelord, getting so lost in his bloodlust until Captain America and the Avengers show up to be like, dude, you got him. Chill out. And in at number 8 is Deadpool vs. Bullseye. Reading through issue 11 of the 2008 volume of Deadpool just made me remember why I love Deadpool. Not that I forgot or anything, but man, he's just nuts, which makes it so good when the foe he faces is almost just as bonkers as he is. This time, it's Hawkeye, but not actually Hawkeye. It's actually Bullseye dressed as Hawkeye because this is happening during Dark Reign, and that's a long story on its own, which maybe we should do an attempt to explain of that at some point. For now though, Bullseye/Hawkeye has been contracted to take down Deadpool. In the last issue, he managed to get an arrow right through Mr. Pool's noggin. So, in this issue, Deadpool takes it out and his brain is still half regenerated as he tries to take on Bullseye at this meat farm. Now, listening to his half-formed brain, Deadpool takes cover into a meat locker and decides his best course of action is to, quote, be the meat, and he suits up in a butchered pig, using it as makeshift armor. Wade charges Mr. I, who had conveniently run out of arrows, lands a good crack, rack, and a crock, and then takes a swift kick to the no man's land. The fight transitions to the kitchen, where Bull's Hawkeye, or whatever you want to call him, comes at Wade with a buzzsaw, and Deadpool, wielding 2 meat hooks, trips, grips, and sends a hook straight through this fellow mercenary's chest. The dynamic between these two psychos is just a treat to read, but I'd honestly recommend just reading the whole of this volume of Deadpool itself. It's fantastic. Number 7, Storm and Emma Frost. A bit of a lesser known rivalry between 2 comic book characters is the one between Aurora Monroe, Storm of the X-Men, and Emma Frost, the White Queen of the Hellfire Club. Now back in the day, Emma was a villain more than anything else, and during Uncanny XMen 151 and 152, the White Queen ambushed Storm, using her telepathic powers to swap their bodies, and then enacted a plan for the Hellfire Club to attack the X-Mansion. Now after a whole lot of kerfuffle involving Kitty Pryde, Emma lost control of Storm's powers, and that gave Storm the opportunity to swap their minds back. Storm gets the tempest caused by Frost under control, then saves the White Queen from a massive fall, all heroic-like, but being the villain, Emma tries yet again to attack Miss Monroe, prompting Storm to straight up smack Emma with a massive bolt of lightning. She flies up into the air, raging like the goddess she is, then flies back down, grabs Frost by the throat, and scares the hell out of her by almost taking her life, before Wolverine, of all people, talks her back to morality. It's fantastic. I love Emma Frost, but I think because of this, I love Storm a little bit more. Number 6, Kingpin versus Grey Hulk. The Hulk is an interesting character. He's gone through many changes over time, even having different identities than just his regular green, savage, smashy smash one. One of his first, when he was still a Grey Hulk, would be Joe Fixit. Joe Fixit is a persona of the Hulk who is a relatively intelligent Las Vegas mob enforcer. It's great. Well, this year, in 2023, he got his own series. Fixit is specifically the enforcer for the Berengeti crime family, and in the series, Mr. Berengeti's operation becomes the focus of a certain Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin of Crime, who is planning to strong-arm a takeover. Problem is, you can't really strong-arm anything when one of the people you're facing off against is the Incredible Hulk. The best part about Joe Fixit is the fact that no one seems to be able to work out that he is just another version of the Hulk, so he is constantly underestimated. Within the first few moments of Kingpin's meeting with Mr. Berengeti, the plan he had goes south very quickly, and he decides to smash the man's desk, which is when Mr. Fixit enters the fray. Fisk's goon is slapped aside like a piece of unwanted salami, and then Fisk, who has gone toe-to-toe with Spider-Man, who, as we know from part 1 of this list, is usually holding back, comes bull-charging at Fixit, who obviously tanks 3 blows without flinching before grabbing Wilson's fist, hoisting the massive villain over his head, and then throwing him through the floor into the casino, and then picking him up and slamming him down into the floor again, and then holding his arm hostage until Fisk says that the meeting is over in English, then French, then Pig Latin. Priceless. And at number 5 is Batman vs. the Hyper Clan. This point is eerily similar to the Manchester Black vs. Superman point on part 2 of Brutal Villain Defeats. In 1997's JLA, helmed by Grant Morrison, a team of superheroes shows up on Earth and begins fixing problems and completely eradicating supervillains, gaining popularity with the people that rivals the Justice League. The difference here is that this team of superheroes are actually white Martians. Unsurprisingly, the first of the Justice League to find this out was Batman himself, who managed to evade being captured unlike the rest of the League. Sneaking into the HyperClan's base, he managed to lure one of their members, a mortal, who he strung up with a little Batarang-held sign that read, "I know your secret." When 3 other members of the HyperClan showed up, Batman brought them down with a single match and a circle of gasoline, turning their one weakness to fire into his greatest ally, because he's Batman. Number 4. Darkseid. Darkseid is not a character you mess with. He's incredibly powerful with an insanely capable mind, and the ability to practically never pass away. Sure, we could talk about his defeat at the hands of Batman, but that's kinda boring. Batman's a regular guy, sure, but he's also Batman. Batman. What we want to talk about is Volume 3, Issue number 2 and 3 of this comic called Superpowers. This comic was made to go along with the toy line, so we already should slightly suspend our knowledge of what various heroes and villains are actually capable of for right now. Now in the story, Darkseid's Omega effect had been dwindled to almost nothing thanks to Mr. Miracle, Tyr, and Mr. Freeze. After being betrayed by his people, he winds up teleporting to Earth with the last of his energy. Now, covered in a cloak, Darkseid is forced to rob a store just to find more clothes and remain unnoticed. But just after he does so, Darkseid is confronted by a pair of muggers in an alleyway. A pair of regular old human muggers who bully him, threaten him, and then knock him out cold with a chain just to rifle through his pockets and run off into the night. But the best part is how he looks up with a big Darkseid frown and goes, "Oh, surely my plight can sink no lower." You never see Darkseid like this, and certainly not in a fedora and a trench coat. Mwah. Number 3, Staro versus the Justice League. Despite how ridiculous the idea of a massive starfish-looking alien that can control minds is, Staro the Conqueror is still one of the Justice League's earliest and most dangerous foes. All the way back in the Brave and the Bold issue 28 from 1960 is our first ever introduction to Staro. Now this was before he used starfish facehuggers to control minds and instead would use a telepathic beam to control huge scores of people. When Staro did this to a town of people using one of his deputies, the Flash happened to take note of the fact that one kid, Snapper Carr, who was possibly the most annoying kid to grace the pages of comics, was immune to the effects of Staro's mental control. But it was a mystery as to why. It turns out that Snapper was covered in calcium oxide, aka lime, from when he was working on a lawn earlier in the day. Lime, used by oystermen to fight starfish off of their oysters, also happens to block the powers of Staro, curiously enough, and so Green Lantern grabs a bunch of barrels of the stuff from a nearby farm, and the Flash grabs bags and bags of it from a chemical warehouse, and they team up to proceed to absolutely cover Staro in lime, imprisoning the Conqueror in an unbreakable shell of lime. As it says in the comics, a living statue of lime. Number 2, Firestorm versus Parasite. Rudolph Jones found himself exposed to a strange form of radiation, which changed him into a bald, green-skinned parasite with the ability to absorb the life energy of others. Well, in Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, issue number 86, Parasite is released from an area he is being held in and goes on a rampage, draining multiple people of their life energy, including Firehawk, who fell pretty easily to this villain. Now luckily, the hero Firestorm is nearby. At this point in time, Firestorm has become the world's fire elemental and received a pretty significant power boost. Almost as if to prove this, Firestorm comes in hot on Parasite with a blast of flame, and then, when Parasite tries to drain Firestorm's power, the hero is completely unaffected as he says, quote, "My powers come not from myself, but from the earth. I don't have power, I am power." And in a last-ditch effort, Parasite decides to try and trade energy blasts with Firestorm. Now unfortunately for Parasite, it is nowhere near an equal fight. He uses up all of the energy he took from Firestorm, and then just trying to hold back Firestorm's blast, Parasite goes through his own reserved life energy until he is on the brink. Realizing he will lose, he begs Firestorm to stop, saying that Firestorm would bring the end for Parasite, to which Firestorm simply says, "That was my intention." Luckily for him, Parasite was saved by the allies of Firestorm who told him to stop, but this hero left Parasite emaciated from using up his own energy. And finally, and at number 1 is Joker versus the Red Skull. Now look, the Joker is a maniac, an absolutely insane criminal lunatic, but hey, he is an American criminal lunatic, goddamn. Which means dealing with someone with the past of the Red Skull is an absolute no-no. Yes, these two villains teamed up together in the Batman and Captain America Team-Up Special, back when DC and Marvel actually got along with each other. Naturally, these heroes' two greatest villains team up to take them on, but I guess it turns out that even Joker is above the morals of a World War II era war criminal. The Red Skull hires the Joker to steal an atomic doomsday device, which the Clown Prince of Crime totally agrees to do, until he sees Red Skull waltz out with a certain symbol front and center on his outfit, indicating his involvement in WW2, which is then confidently confirmed by the Red Skull. This is when the Joker delivers the line about being an American criminal lunatic, and the two simultaneously attack each other, Joker with his venom and the Red Skull with his quote dust of death, which they are both immune to. This is when Joker gets smacked over the back of the head with a wrench, but eventually the fight makes it onto a plane where the Joker overpowers Red Skull and they both go tumbling down through the sky alongside the atomic device they stole, destroying them both in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Now I don't know if I'm more shocked at Joker's switching of sides or the fact that they had a fist fight while straddling the top of an active fat boy. But coming in at number 10 is Jack Frost. When Jimmy Olsen was on a game show back in the Silver Age series Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen number 33, a special prism appeared randomly in a garbage dump that, for some reason, turned the thoughts of the game show contestants into reality. Just go with it, it's a comic book, okay? So, when Jimmy answered a game show question with Jack Frost, that's exactly who appeared. Jack Frost, as a villain, threatened to plunge the world into a new ice age. Now I'm sure that's not at all what Jimmy had in mind, but luckily he is Superman's pal, so what was Superman's solution? Simple. He would just go fly into space and move the frickin' sun closer to the Earth. Not only is this an absolutely ridiculous feat, which is theoretically completely impossible, but it was incredibly embarrassing looking for Jack Frost, who had to run away from Superman, who was essentially chasing the freezing villain with the sun. Once Jack Frost had retreated into a deep, cold cave, Superman put the sun back where he got it so it didn't destroy the Earth. The bonkers part about this is that he did all this nonchalantly as if he was moving furniture. Number 9. Hank Henshaw. After Superman's infamous death at the hands of Doomsday and his not exactly surprising return to life, Superman had to clean up the messes made in his absence, including some imposter Supermen. One of which would be the cyborg Superman, Hank Henshaw, that took over the role of Superman in his place. This cyborg wasn't really doing a great job with his Supermaning, and I think most would agree that he was really tarnishing the name of Superman. Because he was. Hank ruined Soup's memorial, and more importantly, he had just blown up Coast City, taking the life of millions of people. Now, when Superman actually returns from the dead, he doesn't have his powers back just yet, so the conflict actually lasts a little while. But once Superman gets his powers back, you best believe he beats this sucker, and in one page no less. Hank is a cyborg, like I said, so Superman ends this guy by simply punching him straight through the chest and then using his super speed to shake him so fast his screws come loose and he just straight up falls apart. Superman shook this sucker to death. Number 8. The Marquee of Death. In 2009's Fantastic Four number 566, Dr. Victor Von Doom reveals to us and his people that he had learned almost everything he knows from one incredibly powerful reality warping villain called the Marquee of Death. With his master now on his way to see how Dr. Doom had fared as ruler over the Earth. Only when the Marquee shows up with his mysterious new apprentice, he was less than happy with the progress Doom had made on Earth, and to punish his old apprentice, he attacks. The Marquee completely warped reality, making Doom think he had actually won the fight, and then snatched the victory away, set him on fire, turned his heart to stone and his blood to acid, and then sent him back in time to the Pliocene age to be eaten by megalodons. Do you realize how insane that sentence is on its own? That should be the point right there. But over the course of the rest of the story, the Marquee goes on to fight the Fantastic Four, almost beating them, but he is brought to a point of nearly being beaten, which is when, out of nowhere, his apprentice, the new one, shows up and slaps and destroys this reality warping villain, but not before revealing that he is actually Dr. Doom himself. Apparently, Dr. Doom survived being eaten by megalodons and being turned to stone and his blood to acid, gained enough power and dark magic to completely change his form, became the Marquee's new apprentice, even defeating Uatu the Watcher so he wouldn't be discovered, and he did all of that to hide in plain sight to get his revenge and finally defeat the Marquee of Death. If you guys are enjoying this list so far, make sure you check out the rest of the channel for parts 1 to 3 and maybe subscribe while you're there so you don't miss part 5 and all the rest of our comic book loving content. Thank you. In at number 7 is the Superman Revenge Squad. After discovering the planet of the Superman Revenge Squad, Superman wastes no time at all and charges at the planet with a full frontal assault armed with nothing but his abilities and a strange package attached to his chest. The Revenge Squad fires all their most dangerous, most powerful weapons at Superman, firing everything they think will take out the Man of Steel. They all impact on Kal-El, and the villains think they've won. For a moment. But when the dust settled, they didn't even leave a scratch. Instead, the package on Superman's chest detonated, encircling the whole planet in a layer of mist. Now, Superman then yells down to the villains from the heavens, explaining if any of them pass through the mist leaving the planet, they will suffer total amnesia, forgetting any hatred they have for Superman. They can remain trapped on their base, being angry and upset, or they can rejoin the cosmos devoid of all grudges. Either way, he doubts he will ever see them again, and then he just flies on back home. And in at number 6, Simon. Simon Jones is a villain of the Teen Titans who has vast telekinesis and telepathic powers, and he is also the leader of the Fearsome Five. All of that, but he basically just calls himself Simon. But cool, because there's a P in front of it, so we know that he is a psychic dude, I guess. Cool. In Salvation Run number 2, Simon is among the new Injustice League when a bunch of villains, including them, get exiled to an alien world. Simon, who is standing among some pretty big name villains, attempts to convince his fellow supervillains that escape is impossible, and so he then proceeds to lay down plans for beginning a new civilization, involving all the female villains getting pregnant and giving birth as soon and as frequently as possible. But luckily, the Joker is also here, and he doesn't seem to be a fan. Joker very, very abruptly interrupts Simon, tossing a rock that hits the guy square in the noggin, and then running up and smashing Simon over the head repeatedly with a rock, assuming control. Number 5, Captain Boomerang. This brutal defeat is so quick and so abrupt, there isn't even much I can really say about it other than you should never put a captain up against a general. In 2016 Suicide Squad, in literally the second issue, Task Force X are sent on a mission to Russia to retrieve or destroy an unknown device. Well, turns out that the device is actually a portal to the Phantom Zone. Rather than leave it be, which would probably have been smart, Captain Boomerang approaches the portal and is almost instantly incinerated down to his ankles by none other than General Zod, using his heat vision. I doubt the Boomerang guy would have been able to help much in the squad's fight against Zod, and honestly it's a miracle any of them survived at all, but I never expected this to happen so abruptly and to one of the main members of the squad. And in at number 4 is Mr. Mixel Pik. The villain known as Mr. Mixel Pik is both incredibly powerful, but he also doesn't really do anything that bad. He's usually just a big old nuisance. In Superman Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, a whole bunch of Superman's villains all make their play on the Man of Steel, and when their threat is ended, Superman is still left wondering why the heck this is all happening, when he realizes the only villain that wasn't among them was the fifth dimensional imp himself, which is when he finally reveals himself. He goes on about how, being completely immortal, he gets really bored. He spent 2,000 years just floating around doing nothing, and then 2,000 years doing good deeds and being nice, and then he spent 2,000 years being a mischievous little imp, and now, of all times, he decides he's gonna start being evil, and his first evil act is to kick off the next 2 millennia, well, by taking out Superman. That's basically what he says. But I don't think it was like that. Anyways, Mr. Mix reveals his horrendous true form and goes on the attack. Unfortunately, Superman's girl Lois Lane figured out what to do. Superman grabbed the Phantom Zone projector, and as he was about to use it on this magical imp, Mr. Mix spoke his name backwards, which would return him back to the 5th dimension. Unfortunately, this happened simultaneously, and Mixel Pik was torn in half between both the Phantom Zone and the 5th dimension. And apparently Superman did this completely on purpose, and then he runs off to go and sulk about it. Number 3. Dinosaurus. The Viltrumites from the Invincible comic series are a race of near invulnerable, incredibly strong, world-conquering aliens, but none among them stands as strong and as invulnerable as Grand Regent Thrag. Battle-hardened over thousands of years, only the most powerful characters can even hope to stand mano-a-mano against this powerhouse. David Anders, the villain known as Dinosaurus, is not one of those characters. While Dinosaurus is very strong, it's more so his his intelligence that is his greatest weapon. Dinosaurus allied himself with Invincible around issue 90 of the comic, and in an attempt on Mark's life by Thrag, Dinosaurus comes to Invincible's aid, which he had to know would not go well. Dinosaurus attacks Thrag, but his claws shatter like glass on Thrag's skin. Thrag then proceeds to pummel Mr. Anders, only stopping when he was distracted by an explosion. This brief moment of pause gave Dinosaurus the chance to chomp on the Grand Regent's head, but unfortunately, just like his claws, Dino's teeth also completely shatter, not even leaving a scratch on Thrag, which gives Thrag the chance to first mock the guy, but then break his jaw and leave him to think about his mistake. And in at number 2 is Vulcan. In recent years, the red planet that was formerly known to us as Mars has become home to a group of mutants known as the Iraqi, who renamed the planet to Arakko. These mutants differ from the Krakoan mutants we know by years and years of a constant battle for survival. Because of that, the Iraqi are a warlike people. They despise weakness and take on almost any challenge as a means of strengthening themselves. Because of this, duels and challenges are a key part of Iraqi society. Now, the Iraqi are ruled by a group called the Great Ring of Arakko, which is made up of almost completely Omega level mutants. One of those mutants is an incredibly disliked guy by the name of Tarn the Uncaring. Now another Omega level mutant who is also pretty unliked by a lot of people is a guy by the name of Gabriel Summers, aka Vulcan, who wields massive energy manipulation abilities, which he can use to take away mutant powers. The problem is, Tarn's ability is also to take away mutant powers. As part of a big convoluted plan, Vulcan challenged Tarn for his seat on the Great Ring of Arakko, which all comes to a head in X-Men Red issue 3 from 2022. Just as the fight begins, both mutants simultaneously negate each other's powers, turning their fight into a straight up physical altercation. At first, Vulcan gets in a few good hits. Meaning 2. He gets 2 hits. But he didn't seem to take Tarn's face tentacles into account, one of which catches Vulcan's fist, allowing Tarn to land a face-shattering punch. He then grabs Vulcan's arm with one hand and completely snaps it, then slams his face into the Coliseum floor and crushes it with 3 swift punches, winning the fight. And in at number 1 is Tarn the Uncaring. Ooh, surprise! You thought that was the end of the story. Well, nope. Right after Tarn has turned Vulcan into a floor decoration, he celebrates his win, exclaiming that he is unkillable and asking who will challenge him now. And to his surprise, someone answers. You see, another powerful mutant who is also hanging out on Arakko is none other than Magneto, who has been featured a few times in this series. Magneto comes floating into the Coliseum with his helmet and calls Tarn a stain on the planet, challenging the recently victorious mutant whose psychokinetic power-stealing abilities have now returned. But if you think that will put Magneto at a disadvantage, you are sorely mistaken. Iraqi combatants are allowed to use weapons outside of their powers, and like I said, Magneto had his helmet, which, if you are unaware, blocks mental powers. Before Tarn even finishes his sentence to accept the challenge, Magneto uses his metal controlling powers to slam his helmet onto Tarn's head, blocking his powers from being used, and then, in one swift move, he crushes the helmet and Tarn's head like a can of pop. It's so fast and so ruthless, and it's the most badass moment I have ever seen.
Number 10, just his bones and a beautiful memory. This one chokes me up every time. It's not only physically brutal, but emotionally brutal. Like so many superhero defeats that stick with me truly seem to be. In this case, it is Superman himself who is defeated by his friend and ally Wonder Woman. This all goes down in the story from outside of the main continuity, Wonder Woman Dead Earth. In this comic, Diana awakens in a post-apocalyptic world, where she seems to have forgotten what happened to the planet. There was a great war, and following it, a great fire, and it is in issue 3 that she actually finds out the truth about what happened to this now dead Earth, and her involvement in that. What happened was the Great Fire, and the Great Fire was her. In the past, in Dead Earth, the Amazons attacked humankind, and while Diana attempted to lead peace talks between both sides, this ultimately fails, and then the humans decide to basically nuke Themyscira. Diana's full power is unleashed when her bracelets are removed, but it's not enough to stop the nuclear strike against her home. In the end, her mom, her sisters, her entire world are all destroyed and lost to her. Superman rushes to help, but also arrives too late after prioritizing his own parents, who also were victims of a nuclear attack in Smallville. Smallville. Her power fully unleashed, heartbroken and filled with rage, Wonder Woman takes out her frustrations on Superman. The two fight, and ultimately this untethered and unlimited power that Diana has tapped into proves to be enough for her to destroy Clark after their fight also has obliterated the Earth via collateral damage. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button? I know there's a bunch of you that aren't subscribed, so if you want to subscribe, it helps us out. Number 9. The Justice League are dead. Welcome to Dark Crisis. Or really, welcome to Justice League issue number 75, the beginning of Dark Crisis. In this issue, the Justice League goes up against Pariah. Pariah used to be a scientist trying to stop the death of universes who basically became corrupted when he was cursed to watch worlds end over and over again without being able to do anything to save them. I mean, to be fair, that would, I think, make pretty much anyone corrupted and kinda crazy. Pariah is back, and this time he intends to end the suffering of the multiverse by ending the heroes of the main continuity. He does this because he believes in destroying the main continuity he'll kind of be able to end the cycle of destruction, seeing it as kind of the root of the problem because the heroes from that reality have in essence meddled too much with the state of the multiverse. So he's like, in order for us to save the multiverse, we kinda gotta get rid of you guys. As a result, he seemingly handily defeats the Justice League in one go, blasting them with his own power after making them fight sort of the darkness, which is like an army of evil characters they've fought before, but really it's just the darkness, leaving only Black Adam to survive, return to Earth, and tell the tale of what happened. Of course, the Justice League would return because, this is comics, we gotta come back around to it. But still, this issue and their initial fate here was pretty wild. Number 8, and that will be the end of the X-Men forever! What can I say? I'm a sucker for the classics. This one comes to us from the old days of X-Men, the Jack Kirby and Stan Lee days. In issues number 17 and 18 of Uncanny X-Men, Magneto is revealed to be the villain who has infiltrated the X-Mansion, having returned from outer space where we last saw him be transported to by the Beyonder. He has returned to once more resume getting revenge on the X-Men and mankind. It isn't until the end of issue 17 that Magneto is revealed as he greets the parents of Warren Worthington III, aka mutant student Angel's parents, having handily defeated almost all the X-Men one by one after luring them to the mansion. Magneto's plan is to send them up in an air balloon, which is basically like attached to a metal ball that contains them. Fortunately, while initially defeated in issue number 17 and struggling to escape in issue number 18, Iceman ends up getting showcased as the true hero in this issue. Kinda helps save the day here, almost single-handedly defeating Magneto just as the X-Men escape their deadly air balloon fate and return to back him up. Number 7. You Are Not My Father. Probably one of the most emotional fights, especially when we consider that at the time we had a lot of complex emotions about, well, at least one of these people, happens between Professor Charles Xavier and his star pupil, Scott Summers, aka Cyclops. I'll let you guess about who he had complex feelings about. This one went down during the events of Avengers vs. X-Men. It happens at a tense time in the history of the X-Men, not just because they were up against and at conflict with the Avengers as a result of a debate about what to do with the incoming Phoenix Force, but because of the revelations that had happened in recent years in regards to Charles's more shady practices, like not telling his students that the danger room they were training in had actually itself become a sentient AI mutant who was in essence kind of being oppressed by the headmaster of the Xavier Institute, for example. In the end, Charles attempted to talk down Scott, who at this point had the full power of the Phoenix Force, or he takes the full power of the Phoenix Force during this fight, and uses it at his fingertips. Basically, he was also being corrupted by that. Himself filled with a bunch of complex feelings at the time in regards to Charles, Cyclops ends up refusing his once mentor's help, and instead kills him in a blaze of phoenix flames. Despite the fact that Charles at this point was a controversial figure, he was still, I would say, considered to be more hero than villain. And despite the fact that Cyclops himself is usually known for being a hero, he still defeated a man often also known for his own heroic and idealistic dreams. Number 6. The day the proudest, most noble man ever finally fell. Obviously, I'm kinda trimming down that quote a bit, but it just fits a little bit better in my point. What an iconic defeat. So iconic it not only shook the comic book world, but also the everyday world as well, making headlines. And sure, all in all, this was kind of a publicity stunt to help boost comic sales, but it also became a huge story for comic book fans everywhere to look back on for years to come. While Superman would return, his defeat against Doomsday and ultimate initial death in the comics would be felt the world over. The death of Superman is epic, and I personally always like like coming back to it, not just for Clark himself, but for the characters that are a big part of his world. Lois and Jimmy, his parents, John and Martha. Makes me feel so many emotions. Also, why was Jimmy so handsome in the 90s? I ask myself that every time I return to Superman comics in the 90s. I'm like, Jimmy, you're looking real jacked. Number 5. Take heart, Kitty. Oof, this one hits me right in the feels. I go back to what it felt like the first time I read this one, and whoo, it got me. This defeat comes to us from the pages of one of my favorite ever X books, I believe, the first volume of Marauders, which started back in 2019. I think this is one of my favorite X books of all time. I mean, I'd have to really think about that and rank those, but pretty sure this is up there if it's not in the top 5. Although, I think it is in the top 5. For me. In issue number 6, we're caught off guard when Sebastian Shaw shows up on a boat where Captain Kate, the leader of the Marauders, has been left alone. Now for those who haven't been keeping up with, the Krakoa era X-Men stuff and what it means for Kitty Pryde, initially she had problems using the gates on the island and basically became the captain of a ship and the leader of the Marauders. Not Sinister's Marauders, not those Marauders. She was reclaiming the name for a heroic group of buccaneers that would basically sail the seas and help to free mutants in countries where they otherwise were not free, helping to bring them to Krakoa. And honestly, the team is also star-studded. Here, Kitty preferred to go by Kate. That is, until she died. Sebastian Shaw shows up to attack Kate with fast-growing Krakoa seeds. Considering she can't use the gates and currently can't phase through Krakoan materials, Kate becomes restrained as a result. Lockheed is netted and tossed overboard, and Kate is left to sink alone, along with the ship she is on, which Sebastian of course blows a hole in. This plot point is made even more devastating by the implication that Kate will not be able to be resurrected, as this plot point is made even more devastating by the implication that Kate will not be able to be resurrected by the Five as a result of her inability to interact with Krakoan gates. Number 4. Everything Cracked. The Final Crisis story is all about the brutal defeat of superheroes and really kind of like everyone on Earth. Final Crisis was the story of how Darkseid basically took over the world by broadcasting the anti-life equation to everyone on the planet via email, text, radio, and television broadcasts, basically making them realize that he is the one true ruler of everything, and so they may as well just give up and surrender to him. It was brutal, devastating, and honestly affected pretty much everybody in the comics. Eventually the heroes would manage to rise up and take back the planet, but for a while there, it was really bleak. Things got so bad that they even caused Batman to break his one rule against using guns in order to take on Darkseid. And this event started with the death of Martian Manhunter as well. Rough. Number 3. The one true enemy of the great Charles Xavier. Oh boy, we are going to the Ultimate Universe for this one, so you know it's gonna be brutal, right? This comes from the Ultimate X-Men series. Here, Sinister, who looks super different in this universe, so if you're like, wait a minute, who's that? That's Sinister? Yeah, it is. He infiltrates the X-Mansion and manages to sneak up on Charles Xavier himself, despite his immense telepathic powers. Xavier here is no match for Sinister, who takes him out of the security room he was in, where he was seemingly surveying his students. When Charles asks Sinister where he's taking him, Sinister responds that he's escorting Xavier to his one true enemy, and then he pushes him down some stairs. It's completely awful, really. Xavier isn't the only one who gets brutally and honestly insultingly messed up by Sinister in this issue. Angel also in this fight goes from being intimidating in one panel to basically mentally manipulated into choking himself against his will in another panel. So yeah, which I mean, I don't know. I kind of expect something like that for Angel, but Xavier? It's not fair. That's terrible. Number 2. Instead, I will simply break you. Possibly one of the most powerful moments I've ever read in Batman comics. This epic issue that was an integral part of the Nightfall story is a whirlwind of a fight. And not only that, but overseen by a powerful inner monologue from Batman about all the wounds he has taken to get to this point, that truly highlights the struggles that really sum up this character, who against all odds always comes out on top, right? Not this time. In issue number 497 of Batman, this was the moment that Bruce fell in his fight against Bane. Bane came to finish him, but rather than kill Batman, decided to simply leave him broken, breaking his back over his knee in that massive and iconic splash panel. Number 1. But I saved you. I did it. This one made me cry all over again as I sat at my desk and reflected on it, revisiting it again. Oh boy, okay. So here we're talking about the death of Spider-Man, which honestly happened more than once in the Ultimate comic book line and universe, but I do think that this is my favorite death. This is Spider-Man's death done right, is what I mean, in my mind. If you have to do it, obviously, because I don't think many of us would really ask for something this heartbreaking to happen, but you know, here we are, it happened, and it's so sad. During Ultimate Spider-Man issue 159 through to issue 160, we see Peter in his final fight. In the final moments of this final fight, unmasked and with nothing really left to lose, he is forced to give it his all to protect the people of New York City, and more specifically, his friends, his family, his loved ones, and the people of his own neighborhood. In the end, despite everything he does in this epic fight, which spans multiple issues, he is defeated by the Green Goblin. And the ultimate version of the Green Goblin is an unstoppable, and as we later find out, immortal tank of a villain. This fight and defeat has it all though. Ups, downs, it's an emotional, action-packed roller coaster. And while Spider-Man does seemingly die, so seemingly does Norman Osborn as well in the end. So while this is a defeat, there's also at least some poetic justice felt in the end too. But goodness, Aunt May, whew, boy do I feel for Aunt May here, oh, it's so awful. Number 10, all of this is prologue. Maybe one of the most powerful losses that I felt in recent history while reading comics came from the event AXE, Judgment Day. Not only is there the initial illusionary loss that our heroes feel, where I actually for a moment thought that they had all been killed by going for the Celestials off switch, only to find out that this was basically a ruse created by the progenitor, but when they actually all physically united to go up against the progenitor in real life and it wasn't an illusion, they failed as well. This all went down in AXE Judgment Day issue number 5, where many were killed as a result of the plan to attack the Celestial altogether and directly head on. Only a few eggs from Krakoa were able to be saved, and so bringing back some of the many who had fallen was a tough choice. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about resurrection protocols which are happening on Krakoa, which is the mutant island right now. It left me wondering as well where this story could possibly go next. And I mean, this story was like a roller coaster. It was actually, I really liked Judgment Day. It was a whirlwind. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, and if you love when we talk about brutal moments, be sure to check out our brutal playlist for even more brutality. Number 9. Delicious. Maybe one of the most gruesome fights to have ever happened involving Spider-Man happens against one of my personal favorite villains, Morlun. And yes, I know, there are many people out there that don't like Morlun, but I do like Morlun. What can I say? I am a sucker for vampires, even if they are weird, multiversal, energy vampires that feed on animalistic totemic energy. During the other story, Spider-Man was suffering from a mysterious illness and was weakened. It was during this time that Morlun struck in issue 526 of The Amazing Spider-Man. Not only does he beat Spider-Man to a pulp here, but he also devours one of his eyeballs, plucking it out. Yeah, ouch. And also, if I may add, ew. I also love that for this point I literally took the quote delicious. Number 8. Be true to yourself. Be the best you are able to. Don't ever give anything but your best. This defeat wasn't a straight up defeat per se, but really a lot of that column A with just a hint of column B. During the Crisis on Infinite Earths event in issue number 7 of the event's miniseries, Kara attempts to rescue her cousin Superman from the clutches of the Anti-Monitor. As the Anti-Monitor stands poised to kill him, Kara comes out swinging. Here, Supergirl proved just how fierce she can be and how determined when it came to protecting others. Ultimately, she was defeated and even killed in this fearsome fight, but at least she did succeed in destroying Anti-Monitor's machines here, and with the help of Dr. Light, saving Cal. Supergirl sacrificed her life to save her cousin, but her death also served to remind him of his own mortality. Number 7. You'll only be remembered as a madman. Professor X really cannot catch a break. In almost every universe he is in, he dies at some point, and usually pretty terribly. And in the case of the Ultimate Universe, he died by having his neck snapped by Magneto during Ultimatum. But hey, at least he got an on-panel death. Very few were quite so lucky during Ultimatum. Though it does feel weird to call being defeated lucky, but here we are. Xavier's famous last words to Magneto are warning him that he has gone too far, and that regardless of what he thinks he can do, wipe out the entire world as though he were a god, wash the human race from its surface, that he will not win, and in fact will go down in history as another madman. Just another madman. When Xavier compares him to the leader of Germany during World War II, however, the Chancellor of the German Reich, you know who I'm talking about, that causes Magneto to snap, which makes sense given Magneto's history. He snaps Xavier's neck in response, so while Magneto would not ultimately win the greater war here, he would win this battle at least, pretty permanently, because you know, Xavier's dead. Number 6. What a lucky man I was. I think the wild thing here is how little is said or thought in this fight. Well, I mean, there are no thought bubbles. I'm sure people are thinking, but we don't get to know what they are because, you know, this defeat comes from the battle between Superman and Doomsday, but in the animated film, The Death of Superman. So yeah, no thought bubbles here. The fight here between Superman and Doomsday somehow comes across as even more brutal and devastating to me than in the comics. Superman is choked by his own cape at one point, which Doomsday rips in the process, and when Superman is ready to give up, it is Doomsday's direct threat to Lois Lane, who tosses a rock at the Brute in the midst of the fight, brave Lois Lane, that inspires Superman to get up one last time. Lois shares that she got Clark's note, and she confesses that she shares his feelings and actually loves him back. Not willing to see the woman he loves die, Superman takes one final swing at Doomsday and manages to break his neck, twisting his head all the way around, killing him. However, this final punch also seals Superman's fate, using his last bit of strength before he too perishes. In the comments on part 1, someone actually talked about how Superman's death here while fighting and defeating Doomsday in any of the versions of this story could be seen as a victory because he did accomplish what he set out to do. And while I agree with that sentiment, because yeah, Superman does defeat Doomsday, Doomsday also robs Metropolis and the world of one of its most powerful heroes during this fight. And so in that way, Superman is kind of also defeated. I mean, he loses his life, so it's kind of like a two-way defeat when you think about it. It's bittersweet, which to me sums up what a brutal defeat is. It's something that is often hard to watch and something that comes with usually a pretty high cost. Number 5. Yeah, I always get up. Man, when it comes to tragic Spider-Man deaths, for a guy that seems to always survive just about anything, we sure have a lot of those. And Into the Spider-Verse, there are multiple Spider-Men and women, Spider-Folks as I like to say, and the reality of Miles Morales, he is Spider-Man, but even in his reality, there was a Peter Parker who was the original Spider-Man. Tragically, almost as soon as Miles gets to know him and he sees that Miles also has spider-like abilities, he's gone, leaving Miles without a mentor until he meets the alternate reality Peter B. Parker. Peter dies while trying to stop Kingpin's plot to open up portals to other dimensions, in the hopes of reviving the family that he lost. After passing on a USB key, or a goober, as it is called by Peter B, to Miles to use it to stop the collider, Kingpin and Prowler confront Spider-Man, and when Peter warns Kingpin that his plan will both destroy the world and ultimately fail in the process, or I mean at least destroy New York here, Kingpin loses his cool, slamming his fists into an already exhausted Spider-Man's chest, killing him. Number 4. This is going to hurt you a lot more than it does me. Famous words that come from Joker before he brutally attacks Jason Todd with a crowbar. This all went down in the Batman story A Death in the Family. Fans at the time were able to vote on whether or not Jason Todd would live or die. After the brutal attack on his life in issue 427 that ends with an explosion going off which buries Jason's body in rubble, in issue number 428 we'd get our answer to that fateful question. And ultimately it would be established that Jason had, in fact, died. Although much later on we learned this wasn't quite true when he seemingly returned from the dead years later as the antagonistic anti-hero Red Hood. Number 3. You losing your cool, Brucey? This is probably one of the most brutal in terms of the devastation that was physically wrought here. For this point we're talking about Wolverine versus Hulk, but in the Ultimate Universe. And you know it's going to be brutal because it's the Ultimate Universe. Wolverine was tasked with hunting down Hulk for Fury, but when he finally does find Hulk, Hulk remarks on how he really doesn't want to be found, also proving that, you know, he doesn't really need to be disturbed because he's actually calm, he's intelligent now, and at that time of no danger really to anyone. At least not in that moment. So long as they don't, of course, goad him into getting angry, of course, which, you guessed it, Wolverine purposefully does here. In response, Hulk and Wolverine begin to fight, and eventually Hulk rips Wolverine in half. And once Wolverine manages to climb a mountain to recover his legs, his lower half of his body, Hulk then threatens to eat one of Logan's legs. Ultimate Universe, why you like this? Fortunately, this pretty brutal defeat of Wolverine is interrupted by She-Hulk, who in this universe is actually Betty Ross. Number 2. What's 17 more years? While Think Mark became one of the most famous and memeable lines from this superhero defeat, great and animated series, I would say in general. One of the most brutal moments in this fight happens when Omni-Man suggests that he could basically just destroy Mark, literally kill him with his own hands, and just make another child if he has to. Asking rhetorically, what's 17 more years? For him as a Viltrumite, his lifespan is of course much longer than a human, so to him 17 years is basically nothing, a very short span of time. However, reducing his emotional connection that has been built up with his son over 17 years to something so seemingly meaningless, as though none of it really meant anything, makes the beating that Mark takes here just even more brutal. Granted, in the greater scheme of things, we know it isn't this simple for Omni-Man, who, it is revealed, does love his son and is unable to actually swing the killing blow, probably because of that. So, number 1. It was a nice piece of work, Kingpin. You shouldn't have signed it. It doesn't get more awful than this defeat right here. This one happened as a greater part of the famous Daredevil story Born Again. In issue number 227 of Daredevil, we are told the story titled appropriately Apocalypse. And indeed, if you are Matt Murdock, it would certainly feel like the apocalypse. Here, Kingpin finds out Daredevil's secret identity and uses it not to simply kill him, but instead to destroy his entire life. First, he comes for his law practice, making it seem as though Matt bribed a witness in a case. But he doesn't stop there. He comes after his finances, his sanity, and even blows up his apartment, and in the process, destroys his costume. However, while DD is left feeling pretty defeated by that point of the whole thing when his apartment goes boom at the end of this issue, he at least now has a name to pin this all on, seeing it all as the work of none other than Kingpin. So that's a plus, I would say. At least he has like a vendetta now to keep him going. Number 10. Daredevil vs. Kingpin. Issue 227 of Daredevil, called Apocalypse, is a significant event in the Born Again story. It is considered one of the most devastating defeats that Daredevil has ever faced. In this issue, Kingpin discovers Daredevil's true identity and uses it to basically destroy his entire life. Kingpin's actions here are not limited to just killing Daredevil. He turns it up to like 11. Instead, he decides to take a more sinister and personal route. Kingpin starts by destroying Matt's law practice, making it seem like he bribed a witness. But that's not all. Kingpin goes on to ruin his finances, his sanity, and even blows up Daredevil's apartment, destroying his costume in the process. This defeat is a turning point for Daredevil, and it leaves him feeling helpless and defeated. However, he does realize that he now knows who is responsible for his suffering. It is none other than the powerful Kingpin. Despite his despair, Daredevil's determination and resilience are stronger than ever as a result. He is ready to fight back and finally take down the Kingpin once and for all. Sometimes you gotta lose everything to beat the baddest guy there is. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not check out our Brutal Comic Moments playlist. Number 9. Superboy Prime vs. The Darkest Knight. This particular fight scene is quite heart-wrenching, honestly. It takes place in the comic book Dark Knight's Death Metal: The Secret Origins. Although the fight itself is brief, it has significant emotional and character development implications. Superboy Prime faces off against the Darkest Knight with the hope of defeating him and saving the multiverse. While he doesn't entirely succeed here, he does turn the tides in favor of his fellow heroes. This story provides an excellent redemption arc for Superboy Prime, who was once a hero but turned into a massive villain due to the heartache of losing his world. During the fight, the Darkest Knight offers to spare Superboy Prime and even invites him to join his army of Supermen. Superboy Prime sees a vision of the life he could have in the future, where he is once again a hero fighting alongside his colleagues. However, he realizes that this would not be the world he lost, as both his parents and Lori would still be absent. Despite the temptation, Superboy Prime ultimately chooses to fight against the Darkest Knight and gives his life in doing so. This is a crucial moment in the story where the tides actually turn for our heroes, weakening the darkness and allowing them to rise up. It is later confirmed that Superboy Prime did indeed die as a result of fighting back, but while he lost the battle, at least the heroes were able to then win the war, thanks in part to his sacrifice. And Superboy Prime either gets his world back through his journey into the afterlife, or possibly through the multiverse's reconstruction following the resolution of Death Metal. Number 8. Black Panther vs. Moon Knight. In the Avengers Age of Khonshu story arc, Moon Knight confronted a majority of the Avengers. During this confrontation, he faced Black Panther directly in Wakanda with his army of Khonshu worshippers. worshippers, Moon Knight's presence was so intimidating that Black Panther actually just chose to surrender instead of fighting him. It should be noted that this was likely a strategic decision on Black Panther's part. However, the fact remains that Moon Knight managed to get what he wanted, a voluntary surrender from Black Panther without even actually having to come to blows. A whole other kind of brutal, really, when you think about it. Especially when you consider that in the next issue, T'Challa was imprisoned, tormented, and basically forced to submit to the power of Khonshu. Number 7. Batman vs. Reverse Flash. This fight was emotionally distressing for numerous reasons, and it represents the exact type of fights I want to highlight on a list like this. In the 2016 comic Batman issue number 21, which is part of the Button story, Batman is compelled to fight against an adversary who completely outclasses him, the Reverse Flash. He is brutally attacked, and even though it appears that Batman is doomed to lose here, we later discovered that he had already kind of won by accepting the fact that a direct fight would result in his defeat. Knowing that his best strategy would be to stall until Barry Allen's The Flash returned, he was able to succeed and save his life despite, well, kinda losing the fight. It was a strategic loss, but he still gets pretty badly beaten. Number 6. Deadpool vs. Moon Knight. In issue number 8 of Vengeance of the Moon Knight, Deadpool and Moon Knight face off against each other. Although Deadpool is known for being a brutal vigilante and anti-hero with superior healing abilities, it is Moon Knight who actually emerges victorious here. The fight between the two characters highlights their similarities and their differences, as they both use pretty violent methods and both have their own inner voices to contend with, and are often both misunderstood characters and heroes. However, despite these similarities, Moon Knight manages to make Deadpool admit defeat and surrender by using his sword, with Deadpool finally saying, "Uncle." And you know Deadpool doesn't go down easy, so if he's saying uncle, I'll just let you imagine what happens. They don't really show us, but it's the fact that they don't show us that like traumatizes me. Number 5. Jason Todd vs. Joker. This is going to hurt you a lot more than it does me. The famous line spoken by Joker before he brutally attacks Jason Todd with a crowbar. This all went down in the Batman story A Death in the Family. Fans at the time were able to vote on whether or not Jason Todd would actually live or die in this story, and after the brutal attack on his life in issue 427 that ends with an explosion going off which buries his body in rubble, in issue 428 we'd get our answer to that question, and Jason would indeed end up seemingly dead. Number 4. Ghost Rider vs. Carnage. During the Absolute Carnage event, Carnage had a field day. He defeated both heroes and villains with seeming ease. Anyone who had ever been in contact with the symbiote in the past was basically a target in this event. Carnage's ultimate goal was to collect all the codices from the spines of those who had ever been bonded to a symbiote. Yeah, you heard that right. From the spines. The list included Alejandra Jones, who was a spirit of vengeance, also known, of course, as Ghost Rider. By the time Carnage arrived at her doorstep, Alejandra had already expended much of her power while defending her village. Unfortunately, Carnage managed to overpower her and take her life. Really sucks because I actually really liked Alejandra. Alejandra was sent to hell, but she was able to return and get her final vengeance on Carnage while also protecting her village. So although she lost her life, at least she got to protect the village, you know? Number 3. Invincible vs. Conquest. I recently got caught up with the first part of the second season of Invincible, and just as before when I watched it, I was blown away by the numerous, intense, and captivating fights and storytelling in this show. This show and comic series does an excellent job of creating both physical and emotional stakes for its characters. While I could talk about any of the memorable fights in the comic series, I want to give a special shout out to the fight between Invincible and Conquest. When Conquest arrives on Earth and demands that Invincible take responsibility as the Viltrumite liaison, Mark is already dealing with a lot of emotional baggage, let's say. Despite this, he decides to take on Conquest in a fit of anger and resentment, only to learn the hard way just how powerful his opponent is. The fight becomes even more intense when Adam Eve enters the fray, having flown herself out of a hospital bed just to help Mark. Number 2. Venom vs. Carnage. At the end of the Absolute Carnage event, Cletus Cassidy as Carnage gave Eddie Brock a choice between saving the world or saving his son. It wasn't a simple choice, but rather a choice between saving his son and basically letting the world fall victim to Null, or not saving his son and, well, the world would probably fall victim to Null anyway, but he wouldn't be the one who was more responsible for this happening. In the end, Eddie chose to save Dylan, which ultimately led, of course, to the awakening and return of Null. Although, like I said, it was a tough choice because either way that was probably gonna happen. This was a brutal defeat to read because either way, Eddie would have really lost and Carnage would win, even if Carnage didn't survive. And even still, somehow, Carnage did end up surviving this, because Carnage is still around now. Number 1, Invincible versus Omni-Man. One of the most memorable and memeable lines from this superhero defeat, and the Invincible animated series overall, I would say, is "Think, Mark." However, there is a more brutal line than that said by Omni-Man during this fight. One spoken when he suggests that he could actually kill Mark with his own hands and make another child, asking, "What's 17 more years?" As a Viltrumite, Omni-Man's lifespan is much longer than a human, so 17 years is a brief span of time to him, relatively. This reduces the emotional connection he has built up with his son to something seemingly meaningless. Especially heartbreaking for us who've been watching that bond build, and then say that, you're like, oh. It's honestly heartbreaking to watch, making the beating that Mark takes even more brutal. Nevertheless, we know that for Omni-Man, who honestly does love his son, it is not that simple. Ultimately, while he wins the fight, he is unable to deliver the killing blow.